You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles, by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 10, Who Was Bigger? Quote, I'm just a singer. Elvis Presley is the embodiment of the whole American culture, unquote, Frank Sinatra. Quote, the Beatles are the Shakespeare of popular music. There's a quality and a longevity to what they did that will outlast all of them and all of us, unquote, David Tennant. Is it fair to compare the two biggest musical acts of the 20th century to determine who was bigger? And if so, what is the appropriate measurement? Starting with the Beatles, we could analyze their impact, influence and legacy based on what people said about them, including the artists themselves. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all, John Lennon said. Since that may be too simplistic, we could also examine statements by music critics. Former Rolling Stone associate editor Robert Greenfield compared the Beatles to Picasso, as, quote, artists who broke through the constraints of their time period to come up with something that was unique and original. In the form of popular music, no one will ever be more revolutionary, more creative and more distinctive than the Beatles were, unquote. The difference between a great band and a musical phenomenon is that a great band produces great music, but a phenomenon goes further to influence a multitude of cultural outlets such as art, photography, literature, fashion, politics, and belief systems. As a result, their influence lasts for years and years. The Beatles' breakup was probably the best thing that ever happened to the Beatles myth, said John Lennon in 1980. I read this book about Mick Jagger where he said after the breakup, at last, we're number one. What he didn't realize was that when we split, we created a much bigger thing than if we had stayed, unquote. For decades after the Beatles broke up, Walter Everett, professor and chairman of music theory at the University of Michigan, said his students knew the Beatles' catalog as well today as they would have 30 years ago. Quote, they were just idolized, said Everett, who has written several books on the band. It was a musical revolution, but also the hair, the clothing, their attitude about the establishment, their support of everybody, young and old alike, to try to understand each other at a very difficult time. Some of that message endures, unquote. As a result, the Beatles phenomenon has kept growing and growing ever since the group disbanded in 1970. Critic Paul Evans said about the Beatles, theirs is the final, great consensus in popular music, not liking them is as perverse as not liking the sun, unquote. A 2009 survey showed that the Beatles ranked high in popularity with the younger generation. 81% of respondents between ages 16 to 29 said they liked the Beatles, 11% said they disliked the band, while 4% said they have never heard of them. By comparison, only 39% of respondents liked current band Coldplay, and 45% said they had never heard of the group. 42% said they liked hip-hop artist Kanye West. Quote, to put this in perspective, try imagining young adults back in the 1960s putting the big jazz bands of the Roaring Twenties at the top of their list of favorites, the survey reads. Not very likely, unquote. Remember that the Beatles were made up of 4 different members. But on their own, John, Paul, George or Ringo could never achieve the same popularity that compares with the phenomenon of the group. That is the genius of the Beatles, where the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Quote, the point is how great the music is, Robert Greenfield said. It isn't about the fact that the Beatles were willing to practice and get better at what they did, it was the fact that that band contained at least 2.5 geniuses, Lennon, McCartney and, at times, Harrison, unquote. But can we compare the achievements of 4 people together compared to one person on his own? In Elvis Presley's case, yes. In 2013, a book written by 2 computer scientists, called Who's Bigger, where historical figures really ranked the most significant people in history. Significance is related to fame but measures something different, the authors said. They performed quantitative analysis to compare historical reputations of politicians, entertainers, scientists and other famous people by aggregating the traces of millions of opinions on the internet. The algorithm also took into account how important people will be 200 years after their death. Jesus ranked number 1 as the most significant person in history, and Shakespeare was number 3. For singers, Elvis Presley was the highest-ranking entertainer at number 69 with Madonna, 121, Bob Dylan, 130, and John Lennon, 162, trailing behind. The long-term historical significance of Elvis Presley rivals that of the most famous classical composers, stated the authors. Roll over Beethoven, 27, and tell Tchaikovsky, 63, the news, unquote. Notably, only individual people were ranked in the Who's Bigger main list, so that means that group entities like the Beatles were not included. However, the authors compiled detailed statistics for special categories including Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees. On that list, Elvis still outranks the Beatles in terms of significance. Presley's ranking is 7.116 and the Beatles' ranking is 6.707. But the Beatles outrank Elvis in terms of fame. The Beatles scored 4.423 versus Elvis at 3.592. In terms of achievement, referred to as gravitas, Elvis ranks at 3.523 versus the Beatles at 2.284. Quote, "We rank historical figures just as Google ranks web pages, by integrating a diverse set of measurements about their reputation, including page rank, article length, and readership, into estimates of their fame, explained by a combination of achievement and celebrity," unquote, explained the authors, Stephen Skeena and Charles B. Ward. Combining the attributes of reputation, fame, and achievement, the Who's Bigger list for Rock Hall inductees ranks Elvis Presley slightly above the Beatles, with John Lennon and Paul McCartney holding their own just a few slots below their own group. Now that it's been established that Elvis Presley has one of the most recognizable names on the planet, in terms of legacy, it is astonishing that his image is still tarnished to many because of the time and circumstances in which he died. With every passing year, it has become ever more clear that Elvis picked the absolutely worst time to die, wrote Washington Post writer Amy Argett-Singer. Elvis died during what people refer to as the Fat Elvis period, she explained. Due to the circumstances of his death, many seem to forget all the successes Presley had in the later part of his career. Throughout the 1970s, Elvis was still selling millions of albums and performing to sold-out crowds. He even fit, quote, quite nicely into his jumpsuits through most of the era, thank you very much. However, according to Argett-Singer, mature Elvis was inescapably tainted in the public mind by the dismal spectacle of his final year or two, the startling weight gain, the sluggish performances, the final collapse alongside a toilet, unquote. Death at age 42 for Elvis was a huge contrast to the lasting images of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison and later Kurt Cobain, since they all died when they were only 27, so in death they achieved the James Dean effect, frozen in a moment of youthful promise. For this reason, the cosmetic image of Presley during his last year of life seems to overshadow the great impact and achievements that Elvis had throughout his entire career. Many still regard Presley only for his achievements and influence in the 1950s. Elvis instinctively understood, as few before him really had, that the music of black and white Southerners was rooted in common ground, said book critic Jonathan Yardley. What he did with this understanding transformed American culture and American life, but it did not transform Presley himself. In time he will be regarded as much more important for his influence on others than for his own accomplishments, unquote. This viewpoint touches on the belief of many classic rock and roll fans that Presley's only achievements worth remembering were his 1950s records. But as time goes on, more and more music fans are starting to realize that this assessment is unfair. As one astute music fan put it, "I once bought into John Lennon's thesis that Elvis really died the day he joined the army, but over the years I have realized that behind all the B and C movies in the 60s was a goldmine of perfect pop. And behind the karate moves and tacky glittering uniforms in the 70s was a chunk of big-arranged grandiose rock and roll. Good for me," unquote. Another unfair assumption in the rock and roll world is that Presley's legacy is not as important or significant when compared with the Beatles. Some regard the Beatles at a higher level because they were songwriters, while Elvis was not. However, Presley excelled and evolved in the arena of live performing, an aspect where the Beatles got stifled during the height of their career. "You know, Brian put us in suits and all that, and we made it very, very big," John Lennon told Rolling Stone magazine in 1971. "But we sold out, you know. The music was dead before we even went on the theater tour of Britain. We would go on and repeat the same 20 minutes every night. That's why we never improved as musicians, Lennon continued. We killed ourselves then to make it. And that was the end of it. George and I are more inclined to say that we always missed the club dates because that's when we were playing music, and then later on we became technically efficient recording artists, which was another thing, because we were competent people, and whatever media you put us in, we can produce something worthwhile, unquote. While the Beatles were forced away from live performing by their circumstances, Elvis devoted at least 1/3 of his 23-year career to it. He believed early on that people wanted to see a show on stage. His mission was to entertain, not just to sing. There's a big difference in singing on a record and singing for an audience, Presley said in August 1956. People can stay home and listen to your records on the radio or phonograph, and it doesn't cost them anything. But when they pay their money to come out and see you at a personal appearance, these people want to see a show. They pay their money to see something with life in it, not just to hear something on a phonograph, unquote. Elvis had a unique charisma on stage that was unmatched by any other performer, along with his paramount vocal range of 3 octaves. People talk of his range and power, his ability and ease in hitting the high notes, said record producer John Owen Williams. But the real difference between Elvis and other singers was that he could sing majestically in any style, be it rock, country, or R&B, because he had soul. He sang from the heart. And that is what made him the greatest singer in the history of popular music, unquote. In 1975, John Lennon made perhaps the most accurate prediction about the Beatles' musical legacy, quote, "I think a lot of the Beatles records can stand up in any period, unless music really changes. You can pick most of the Beatle records, a few of them are obviously of an era, but most of them, doesn't matter what period, what era, that will go down in 200 years, it's the same. When it gets down to the nitty-gritty, it's the song," unquote. Lennon hit the nail on the head. The true test of the lasting influence of his band, and also Elvis Presley, is the longevity of the music. Now, almost 50 years after the Beatles disbanded, and over 40 years since Presley died, to quantify the popularity of the 2 biggest acts in show business, the most accurate proof is in the record sales, which continue to grow up to the present day. But as simple as this may seem, there are many complications to this tabulation. Although historically the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, did not start tabulating record sales until 1958, in later years, they have gone back and recalculated their figures to include all of Elvis Presley's certified singles, albums and EPs released before 1958. The RIAA says that Elvis Presley falls behind the Beatles in terms of total album sales. The RIAA tabulates album sales in the US only. As of April 2018, Elvis has sold 146.5 million albums in the US, which is third behind the Beatles, who have sold 178 million albums, and just 1.5 million less than Garth Brooks, who has sold 148 million. However, when exploring the RIAA Gold and Platinum searchable database online, the RIAA figures show that in the US, Elvis sold twice as many singles, 50.5 million, compared to the Beatles, 25 million. It is worth noting that singles were much more popular in the 1950s and early 1960s when Elvis became popular. The buying trend then shifted to albums in the mid to late 1960s when the Beatles were at the height of their fame. EPs, which contain 3 to 5 songs, are included in RIAA's calculation of album sales, by using a weighted factor depending on the certification level of gold, platinum or multi-platinum status. However, the record sales figures are constantly changing since the Beatles and Elvis Presley are still selling records in the present day. The last time the RIAA awarded new record certifications was 2018 for Elvis, and 2014 for the Beatles. The RIAA certification levels are 500,000 units for the Gold Award, 1 million units for the Platinum Award, and 2 million units for the Multi-Platinum Award, with recertification for each additional million in sales. In terms of numbers, the Beatles have sold 31.5 million more albums in the US than Elvis, yet Elvis sold 25.5 million more singles than the Beatles. Since albums usually contain 10 to 12 more songs than singles, the Beatles would clearly be the winner in terms of US record sales. Nevertheless, the true best-selling artist of all time would have to be the top seller all around the world. When figuring sales of singles, EPs, and albums worldwide, many historians believe that Elvis is the best-selling artist period. However, proving that Elvis has outsold the Beatles on a global scale is hard to document. Currently, there is no independent agency that tabulates global or worldwide sales of musical artists. Global sales statistics would have to be provided by the artist's record company. Presley's record label, RCA, now owned by Sony Music, stated in 2014 that Presley's album sales have reached an estimated 600 million units worldwide. A recent report claimed the same figure for the Beatles. As early as 1986, it has been stated that Elvis Presley has sold a total of over 1 billion records globally. Some say that as time has passed, the King has surpassed 2.5 billion records sold. Meanwhile, it was reported that, as of 2004, the Beatles have sold 1.3 billion records worldwide. Without an official source to track global record sales, we may never know the true number of records sold by either Elvis Presley or the Beatles. Therefore, we may never be able to document who sold more records around the world. Another factor to consider for U.S. figures are the number of sales for uncertified records. The RIAA only includes sales of records which sell over 500,000 units. Any album, EP, or single selling under 500,000 units is not included in the RIAA figures. Therefore, it is possible that the statistics could lean in Elvis's favor just by taking into account the sheer volume of his work. Elvis released over 70 studio albums during his career, while the Beatles only released 13. This number does not diminish the Beatles' achievement since they only recorded for a total of 8 years, while Elvis was recording over a 23-year span of time. In comparison, Elvis has had over 100 different albums, including live albums, box sets and compilations, that have been certified gold by the RIAA, while the Beatles have 48. Paul McCartney, who visited Graceland for the first time in 2013, may have summed it up best: "I thought the Beatles had gold records until I had a private tour of Graceland. The Hall of Gold says it all." Elvis has the most gold, platinum and multi-platinum sales of all of us. Amazing man, simply amazing, unquote. The two musical phenomena will always have a special link to each other in the eyes of the public. This is probably due to the fact that Elvis inspired the Beatles musically, and the Beatles were the only rock and roll act to match Elvis in terms of record sales and popularity. "We wanted to be bigger than Elvis, that was the main thing," John Lennon explained in 1970. "At first we wanted to be Goffin and King, then we wanted to be Eddie Cochran, then Buddy Holly, and finally we arrived at wanting to be bigger than the biggest, and that was Elvis," unquote. In the present day, the Beatles and Elvis Presley are often celebrated together around the world. In 2004, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the birth of rock and roll, the two music cities of Liverpool and Memphis teamed up for a Brotherly City campaign. The Lord Mayor of Liverpool visited the U.S. in January of that year and received the keys to the city of Memphis. That event kicked off a year-long series of events in both cities celebrating the birth of rock and roll. Quote, "Memphis and Liverpool had more impact on the development of rock and roll than just about any other community in the world and are obvious choices to lead in this celebration," said Kevin Kane, president and CEO of the Memphis Convention and Visitors Bureau. A few years later, a joint exhibit of the Beatles and Elvis Presley was put on display for the first time ever. The exhibit, entitled Elvis and Us, was featured at the Beatles Story Museum in Liverpool from 2011 to 2014. It explored the relationship and influences that Elvis Presley had with the Beatles. In 2017, an exhibit called Icons, The Influence of Elvis Presley, opened at the new Elvis Presley's Memphis Entertainment Complex, across the street from Graceland. In that exhibit, the piano which John Lennon wrote Imagine on, is featured along with this quote: "If there hadn't been an Elvis, there wouldn't have been the Beatles." It may be hard to believe, but Elvis is still influencing the Beatles to this day. The Beatles' Love by Cirque du Soleil show in Las Vegas, which has been running since 2006, was inspired with a little help from Elvis. The remixing of a 1968 Presley song helped influence the creation of the Beatles' Love Show, an acrobatic theatrical show set to Beatles music. "I've been getting a little bit jealous," McCartney told Stephen Van Zandt. I was seeing remixes of, like, Elvis things coming out, and I was thinking, that sounds good, man. You know, it's still Elvis, but they've put a new beat behind it. I thought, I kind of like that. McCartney was referring to the 2002 remix of Presley's A Little Less Conversation, which went to #1 in several countries. In 2003, another Presley remix was released for his 1969 song Rubberneckin'. This new one, the Presley remix, is probably better to dance to in a club, McCartney said. So that's the reason for it existing. You could certainly do it with the Beatles, and I know a lot of people have done, sampling the Sgt. Pepper drums or Tomorrow Never Knows, unquote. As a result, when the Beatles company, Apple, began working with Cirque du Soleil to create the Love Show, McCartney along with Ringo Starr encouraged producers George Martin and his son, Giles, to do mashups of the Beatles' music. Although it was Giles Martin who first came up with the idea to experiment and do the mashups, Paul, Ringo, Olivia Harrison and Yoko Ono were definitely on board. Quote, Paul and Ringo came in, and Olivia and Yoko, and they heard it, and that's what they liked that edgier thing, said Giles Martin. And then the rule book was thrown out the window, unquote. The outcome was an audio collage mixing and synchronizing several Beatles songs together. The 78-minute soundtrack includes audio snippets from 200 Beatles songs, many of which are remixed in a mashup style. I love the remixing, said Ringo Starr at the 2006 premiere of Love. I'd heard the music. I mean, Paul and I had been going to Abbey Road quite a lot to hear what George and Giles were doing, but how great. Nobody else could have done it. Nobody else would have had the credibility and the knowledge of what we were doing then besides George Martin. I've been to many Cirque shows, that's why I knew it would work. I know about the music, and they know about that part of it, so it works, unquote. When addressing the criticism that it is sacrilege to mess with the original Beatles music in any way, shape or form, Paul McCartney had this response, to me, sampling means they can't play anything better, which is a great tribute, Paul McCartney explained. People in the street are always doing this to me, oh, I don't like all this rap stuff, it's not as good as you. But it's a new generation, 21st century, you can't expect people to live in the past. If somebody quotes our music in the future, they've always got the opportunity to hear the pure version, unquote. In 2010, an Elvis Presley production for Cirque du Soleil, Viva Elvis, opened in Las Vegas, hoping to find similar success as the Beatles' Love. However, the show, which was a joint venture with Elvis Presley Enterprises, only lasted 2 years. At the time of this writing in 2018, the Beatles' Love Show is still going strong after 12 years. Las Vegas, a city once ruled by the king of rock and roll, is now where the Beatles reign supreme. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, Elvis Presley is celebrated every year during the week of August 16, the day that he died. The annual event, called Elvis Week, officially sanctioned by Elvis Presley Enterprises, attracts fans from all around the world offering special events and concerts to celebrate the king. Elvis Week evolved out of the candlelight vigil held the night of August 15 at the Meditation Garden. The candlelight vigil started as an informal gathering of fans in 1978, the year after Elvis died, with mourners coming to mark the anniversary of Presley's death by visiting his grave at Graceland. Over the years, Elvis Week, designated as the week leading up to August 16, then grew into an official annual one-week festival starting in 1983. Priscilla and Lisa Marie Presley often come to join fans at the candlelight vigil. During a panel discussion at Elvis Week in 2017, Priscilla Presley was asked if Elvis would have believed the magnitude of how his legacy has endured. No, I don't think he ever in his wildest dreams ever would have imagined this happening, that he's just as popular, if not more, right now, Priscilla replied. In fact, he didn't think that reaching the age of 40 still singing rock and roll was in the cards for him, Priscilla continued. He was looking for something to do, something that maybe he should have done or searching again for. I don't want to be a 40-year-old on stage. He thought 40 years old was old, and back in the day it was getting up there. But now it's nothing, it's still young, unquote. In 2017, on the 40th anniversary of Presley's death, there were between 50,000 to 60,000 fans who attended the candlelight vigil the night of August 15. Because of the large number of people, Elvis Presley Enterprises for the first time ever charged a fee for people to attend the vigil. This left many fans shocked, but it still did not keep them away. For Beatles fans, the city of Liverpool started their own International Beatle Week back in 1984. The 7-day music festival dedicated to the Beatles is sponsored by Cavern City Tours, which also owns the Cavern Club, the legendary club where the Beatles got their start. Much like Elvis Week, Beatles fans from all over the world come every year to Liverpool to celebrate the Beatles' legacy with events that include guest appearances from people who knew and worked with the Beatles, as well as tribute concerts. However, International Beatle Week is not sanctioned by the Beatles company, Apple, and Apple has no official involvement with it. In 2017, Cavern City Tours announced that it would be scaling back the events of the festival. Reports are that attendance has been dropping in recent years and many of the special guests who had first-hand knowledge of the Beatles have passed away. Quote, "In the beginning, every musician has their Genesis moment," Bruce Springsteen said in 2012. "Mine was 1956, Elvis on The Ed Sullivan Show. It was the evening I realized a white man could make magic, that you did not have to be constrained by your upbringing, by the way you looked, or by the social context that oppressed you. You could call upon your own powers of imagination, and you could create a transformative self. After that moment," he continued, "there was yesterday, and there was today, and there was a red-hot rockabilly forging of a new tomorrow, before your very eyes." Unquote. A few years later, Springsteen was at the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York for an appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Colbert played a clip from Elvis performing on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and Springsteen started laughing giddily like a teenager. "It still looks great," the boss said. "It's amazing because I was actually that young, 6 or 7 years old, it had tremendous impact," Bruce recalled about seeing Elvis perform on television. "It struck me right away. I got my mother to run down to the store the next week and we rented a guitar. They didn't know how to teach in those days. It was very methodical, so I got bored rather quickly, and put it away until I was 14, when the Beatles stood on this stage, it happened to me again. So I got struck twice by lightning." Unquote. Elvis died too young, and the Beatles broke up too soon, but maybe that adds to their legendary status, with their popularity continuing to soar at record heights into the 21st century. Quote, "As a poor white Southern boy, Elvis created a personal culture out of the hillbilly world that was his as a given," wrote music critic Greil Marcus. Ultimately, he made that personal culture public in such an explosive way that he transformed not only his own culture, but America's. Unquote. "Elvis had one of the strongest souls and spirits about him of any person I've ever seen," said Sam Phillips in 1992, "but you had to have a feeling that this man had the strength and the worth within him to go on and to go on and to go on until we made it, or by golly we didn't make it. It is no mystery at all to me that the man has become the biggest thing in the history of entertainment." Unquote. Elvis Presley's success in the music business in the 1950s and beyond influenced a whole generation of rock and roll performers, the most successful being John, Paul, George and Ringo. "I doubt very much if the Beatles would have happened if it was not for Elvis," said Paul McCartney. "God bless you, Elvis. I still love him, particularly in his early period. He was very influential on me." Unquote. The four British Elvis Presleys, as they were once referred to by journalists, went on to reach new heights as songwriters and recording artists. In 2003, Rolling Stone magazine named the 500 greatest albums of all time. The Beatles hold 4 albums in the top 10, The Beatles, White Album, number 10, Rubber Soul, number 5, Revolver, number 3, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was voted number 1 by an expert panel of singers, musicians, record producers, music critics and historians. Presley's highest appearance on the list is at number 11 with the Sun Sessions. Sgt. Pepper is simply the best of everything the Beatles ever did as musicians, pioneers and pop stars all in one place, the Rolling Stone editor said. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr were never more fearless and unified in their pursuit of magic and transcendence. Unquote. After Elvis took the world by storm in 1956, people started to wonder when the next Elvis would arrive, since the rock and roll era was relatively new. When Beatlemania hit the US in 1964, the press immediately started the rivalry and comparison between Elvis and the Beatles, but no one realized what a rarity they both were. Within only an 8-year span of time, popular music and culture was hit by not one, but two musical phenomena. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, people then began waiting for the next Beatles to arrive, but nobody came. As time has proven, there will never be another Elvis Presley or another Beatles, two acts that made such huge musical and cultural impacts on the world. The groundbreaking musical legacies of both artists offer bodies of work that fans will revel in for generations to come. Nevertheless, the relatively short careers of the king of rock and roll and the Fab Four will always leave the public wondering that inevitable question of what if both artists had more time. "It's nice to think that we made such an impression that people still want more," said John Lennon in the late 1970s. "That's the best way to leave things, with people wanting more," unquote. The end. For more fascinating facts about Elvis Presley and the Beatles, visit the book's official website at elvisbiography.net. Visit the book's official website